Hello listeners, Jordan here. I just want to let you know that you can listen to Nighttime early and ad-free on Amazon Music. Include it with Prime.
You are tuned to the Nighttime Podcast, focused on the fringe of Canada.
Very few of you listening have likely served on a jury, but you probably know someone who has, and chances are the trial that they served on was fairly mundane and unremarkable, but it can happen. Think of someone you know, perhaps your sweet and loving aunt who could never stomach watching a gruesome film or sitting through a true crime documentary. What happens when someone like that gets assigned to a case that features some of the darkest evidence imaginable? How do they get through it? How do they cope? And who picks up the pieces when the deliberations are over and the verdict is delivered? As you'll soon hear, our guest, Mark Farrant, knows all too well how complicated the answers to those questions are. In 2014, Mark received a letter indicating he was on a pool to serve in the jury for an upcoming murder trial. And to put it quite simply, he hasn't been the same since. The trial was that of Farshad Badakshan, a man accused of the brutal killing of his girlfriend. The graphic details of this case that Mark would become immersed in had left him with the crippling effects of PTSD. And to make matters worse, laws that serve to provide jurors privacy have made it nearly impossible for Mark to get treatment. This experience, in the end, has become the fuel for one of Canada's fiercest advocates for the rights of Canadian jurors. Tonight, in this episode, we'll be joined by jurors' right advocate Mark Farrant, and our topic, the dark side of jury duty.
I'm Mark Farrant. I live in Toronto, Ontario. I'm born and bred Torontonian. At present, I'm a justice and mental health advocate. I have taken on this mantle, having served as a jury foreman 4 years ago in a first-degree murder trial that changed my life. And I developed PTSD as a result of the trial experience and also the after effects of the trial, not being able to unpack the images that I saw in the courtroom. So I took it upon myself to make sure that other jurors had the supports that I didn't have when I left the courtroom.
Mm-hmm. Now, as you just said there, presently you're known across Canada really as a juror's right advocate. Thanks to this, experience you had 4 years ago, what were you doing before you got that letter basically summoning you to jury duty? Like, what was your life like prior to that?
I was an executive at a large telecommunications media company. I'd been working in market research, insights, data, all my career. So I've been working in that industry for almost 20 years. And I had a very sort of high-profile position within the organization, working on a major sports property. I had a 3-year-old at home. I'd been recently married, and was, living a middle-class lifestyle in downtown Toronto. I was a very outgoing, social person. I dabbled in a little bit of stand-up comedy on the side. I played sports. I had a well-rounded life.
Mm-hmm. And like, how did you end up in the jury? Is it like the way people would understand it is basically you just get like a letter in the mail assigning you to, show up at the courthouse on blank date for jury duty. Is that how it happened in your case?
In Ontario, they send a questionnaire out. So there's, I guess it's a twofold approach. You'll receive a questionnaire from the Attorney General's office, and that's the questionnaire that gets you into the jury data pool, as it were. Mm-hmm. So I remember getting that questionnaire, and because I work in the industry and in insights and market research, I was interested in it. So I looked at it and sort of filled it out and really didn't think much of it after that. Put it in the mail, off it went. And then I got a summons just before Christmas, and looked at it and suddenly thought, oh dear. So at the time, I remember, talking to my boss and saying, this is serious. It says first degree murder at the top of it. So I knew it was a murder trial. And, he sort of said, well, I don't think you're going to get selected. Let's not worry about it. And I remember at the time thinking, I think we need to worry about this because we should have a plan. So I went into court, and lo and behold, I was selected.
Wow. Give us context as our conversation goes. Tell me about this first-degree murder trial that you served on. Like, what are some of the basic details of that?
Well, it wasn't a trial that a case that hits the national headlines. It did get some local coverage in Toronto. It was a first-degree murder case with what's called an NCR defense. That's a not criminally responsible defense. It was the murder of a young woman. I believe she was 23, a Ryerson University student, and she was murdered in the apartment building, sort of like a student apartment building that she lived in, that was occupied also by her on-again, off-again boyfriend, who was her murderer. She was murdered early one morning. She came down to his basement apartment unit where he attacked her, stabbed her 27 times, slit her throat twice from ear to ear, and proceeded to set her and the unit and the building on fire. So he doused her with an accelerant and himself with an accelerant, and it failed. So the fire never took. He tried to light the basement stairwell on fire, and it did catch, but it didn't take. She also had defensive wounds on her hands and feet, and other parts of her body, which indicated, as we went into the autopsy, indicated that there was a hell of a struggle.
Wow.
So she did not, she put up a significant fight. Awful that she actually, I wouldn't say survived, but she lived through the assault and managed to crawl up the burning stairs of the unit. And by that point, because it was a rooming house, automatically the fire alerted the fire department. It's one of those automatic site-to-site switches. So the fire department were dispatched almost immediately. And I think they arrived almost at the scene, as it were. So she was taken out of the apartment by paramedics, but died on her way to the hospital. Now, the other horrific part of this is that he continued at that point to douse himself with accelerant in an attempt of a suicide at that point, which also failed. So he spent a year in a medically induced coma. So by the time he came to court, he was grossly disfigured. He had lost all the hair on his head, had multiple skin grafts on his face. He had his leg amputated. I believe did not have the use of one arm and was confined to a wheelchair, but he was a shadow of what he used to look like from the pictures that were displayed to the jury.
Wow. And now when you tell the story of, like, as you just did, recounting what happened, like, it's one thing to know the story and know what happened, but when you're a member of the jury, you have to see evidence of all those horrible acts you just described, as well as where it was the NCR defense. you would have likely had to see a lot of evidence related to his self-harm and whatnot. Like, what kind of evidence and exhibits were you, like a regular civilian, exposed to in this trial? How graphic did it get?
It was fairly graphic. The first week, really, of the trial was the autopsy. We were presented with the coroner, who walked us through in great detail each wound. So a superficial puncture wound versus a deep puncture wound, and which wounds would have resulted in a serious injury and the like, and describing a defensive wound. So we might spend an hour just reviewing the cut on the hand, on the across the palm of the hand, and so it's different to see it in that circumstance than to look at it in a magazine or see it on television as part of fiction, because it's real, it happened, and all you have to do is look over your shoulder and see that the parents or the relatives and loved ones in the courtroom with you. So it's really a very different feeling. And, the difference with the jury is that you don't have the ability to raise your hand and say, I've had enough. I think we've gone through this. You can't even talk. So you are absorbing material, and you have no control over the frequency of it or the rhythm of it or the content. So that's another burden that you have to endure. And so, for some, it's not graphic, and for others, it is. At the time I was reviewing it, and it would sit with me. But again, I would go home, and then I would go to work because I was still working during the trial. And some of it would just sort of go away, and some of it would not. You'd retain it.
And as a civilian that's taking all this in at the time, as you were going through this, could you feel the effects of taking in so much, dark, graphic information? Did it feel that way as it was happening?
I was trying to get through it. Let's be honest here. There are days where you're going through really mundane testimony. There are days where it's a day of cell phone records, or maybe even a half a week of cell phone records, and none of it is really that interesting. It's again part of the evidence that you're going to have to understand and might be part of the evidentiary charge. But then suddenly, wham, up come pictures again because of a changing course of the argument, and suddenly, out of nowhere, there it is, and you can't turn away, and you're looking at this, because in the courtroom that I was in what was called a quote unquote a state-of-the-art courtroom. So I had a very large computer monitor basically right in front of me, as did the other jurors. And so you're sitting there unable to look away from some really horrible stuff. And sometimes what's really even more disturbing is the testimony that you hear from first responders and other witnesses. To sit there and watch a 30-year captain of the fire department break down on the stand and start to cry, which happened in the first, I think that within the first 2 weeks of the trial. That's when I knew I was getting into something serious. And so that stays with you too, and the problem is, you're, again, it's your burden. It's the role of the jury to do this. And I really do believe that it's part of the job, but your whole life, that whole 4-month period is completely packed into that case, wall to wall.
Yeah. And now in your case, when this trial concluded, that's kind of when I guess your journey to a juror's right advocate began. So, why don't you kind of tell me about the path you took from serving on the jury, this case being concluded, and then, getting you to where you are now? What trouble did you run into, or problems did you face, in the aftermath of this?
Well, after the verdict was delivered and, we deliberated for a week, I, being somebody that's sort of systematic and working in operations, I fully expected there to be a procedure. So I was waiting for this very well-designed debriefing action at the end of the trial. And that we would be going into a room and we would talk and we would debrief and we would get, I don't like the word closure, but there would be a conclusion. And there just wasn't. We literally packed up our bags back in the jury room. The judge in the case came in and had a cup of tea with us and just, which is unusual. And I learned that was just something that he did, but it was really just to sort of thank us. But that was it for us as jurors. And I just thought, this is incredible. I can't believe that there's nothing here. You're stepping out of this vacuum suddenly, that you're expected to go back into your life. And that's when it started to really take hold. It wasn't immediate. I mean, I was feeling the stresses throughout the trial, certainly, but it just didn't go away. And so I spent, months and months and months trying to shed it and burying myself in work and focusing. My wife and I brought our second child into the world a month after the trial concluded. And so what was supposed to be a very happy time for me just wasn't. And it's something that I'm trying to rebuild with my son. And I just changed as a person. I stopped calling friends. I was not returning emails. I was not going outside of my house. I, put on a brave face at work, but I really was not talking to people. I wouldn't let my daughter out of my sight. I kept a vigil at the foot of her bed. I wasn't sleeping. Everywhere I went, all I saw was blood. I just saw blood and gore. And it didn't matter what I was doing. It just was always there. And I just thought I had to get over this. This is my responsibility. Suck it up, get through it. And, that's the worst advice really that you could give anybody, but that's, what I was trying to do. And so finally my family intervened and said, you really need to go and talk to somebody about this. And that's when we sort of tried to think about where we would go. And so the first place I called was the courthouse, thinking, okay, they do this routinely. They must have services for jurors. And so I called and then left a message and there was no call back. And a couple days went by, I called again and finally got a hold of somebody and hummed and hawed and said, well, we really don't have anything for you. I'm sorry, we just don't do that. And I was just absolutely gobsmacked and questioned why. The person really didn't have an answer for me. Said maybe I should call victim services to see if they had something. And so what I learned was that at the time in Ontario, court-appointed counseling for jurors was available, but it had to have been issued by the judge in the case that you sat on. And because it wasn't done, there was nothing available to me. And I don't blame the justice at all in the case that I sat on because, it's very difficult for a justice to look into the eyes of the jury to know what they're feeling because you're silent. There were times where some of our fellow panelists would cry and weep, but that's about all you're going to get from a physical signal. So I don't blame the justice for not doing that, but I was very angry that there was nothing available for me, and that the onus was on me to go and find that support, which I thought was just absurd. And not just absurd, but it was incredibly difficult. As you probably know, it's difficult to get mental health services at the best of times in Canada. There are enormous wait lists. It's up to a year long to get into the system. I went to my family doctor, and she and I agreed that I was absolutely experiencing symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, but she didn't really know what to do with me. Again, she's a great doctor, but this was difficult. And so I was given a list of psychologists to call. I contacted my own employer EAP program, and this was where the beginning of some of the legal issues started to arise, and that my EAP provider, which is an employee assistance program, couldn't talk to me. They said, "We can't talk to you because you're a juror." I was describing why I was phoning, and immediately red flags went up. And they said, "We're not qualified, and there are legal issues here, and we simply can't do it." And so that door was closed. And then I started to go down this list of psychologists, and one after the other said, "No, I can't talk to you because you're a juror, and I'm concerned about the legal issue." And then finally, I don't even remember how I managed to find them, to be honest. But I finally broke through and found a clinic that specialized in first responders and the military in Toronto, dealing with PTSD and trauma, and made an appointment. And I actually had to go through two different counselors until I found the right fit. But that took over a year. And during that time, I was getting sicker and sicker and sicker, and became ultimately a different person. I still now believe I'm a different person than the one that walked into that courtroom.
In these legal issues that they seem to be so concerned with as you were trying to get help, my understanding is they had concerns about discussing like confidential juror information with you. Is that what they seem to be concerned with?
So you're instructed as a juror not to talk about the trial, and you're instructed not to discuss the trial, any of the trial elements with friends and family, work colleagues. A good justice would caution you on any conversation in social media. You keep it to yourself, and you're not allowed to talk about those trial elements. And you're certainly, the law is very clear on deliberation. So deliberation is sacred. So you are not permitted to discuss with anyone, including a justice or anybody, how a decision is reached. So what happens in the deliberation room stays there. And so that's written into the criminal code within a section called 649. And so, yes, that legal provision is what was raising the concerns amongst the psychologists that I encountered.
Yeah, what I was going to ask is, do you know how the Canadian system of dealing with this compares with other countries? Like if you were in just like the United States or England or something for that matter, is there a different process for what happens after a juror serves?
Yeah, so we're part of the Commonwealth. So in England and in Australia, it's very, very similar. So jurors, again, are not identified. The media is not allowed to report on jurors, identify them in any way, shape, or form. Jurors believe in both those jurisdictions, are prohibited from discussing openly elements of the trial and deliberations. The U.S. is totally different. It's completely different across the border. So jurors are Now it's state by state. Obviously, there are differences, but my understanding is in most states, even in capital crimes, jurors are allowed to talk about exactly what happened. Like, the steps of the courtroom, O.J. Simpson jurors are saying, well, here's what we, my name's Pete, and here's the decision we reached. And they get a book deal, and they're on the Today Show the next morning, and so it's very, very different there. But the stresses and the conditions and the lack of support are the same. So just because it's a sort of freer system, freer, less restrictive, I would say, in terms of the jurors' ability to talk after the trial, there are the same struggles and the same concerns post-trial that we've experienced here in Canada that we're trying to change.
And we'll get into that now, where you've very publicly championed what's being referred to as a jury support bill. It's titled C-417. Could you talk a bit about this bill and what this aimed to change? And, of course, tell us what happened with it, because I understand it was recently discussed in the Senate.
Bill C-417 was a private member's bill that was a direct lift from the Justice Committee. The House of Commons Justice Committee undertook a year-long study of jury duty, mental health, and stress, and produced a landmark comprehensive report with 11 recommendations aimed at improving supports for jurors across the country post-trial, but really also some fundamental reforms that have just really are at the start of what needs to be done. So that the Bill 417 is designed to remove that restriction that jurors face from talking about aspects of the trial and deliberation with a mental health practitioner. So, right now it's illegal for a juror to have a free and open conversation with a psychiatrist, psychologist, licensed therapist. So I wouldn't be able to right now talk about any of the trauma that I experienced in court freely with my doctor, or anything that I experienced during deliberation that caused me ill health. That's illegal. How is a juror supposed to have a free and open conversation and on the road to wellness if they can't address the very thing that's caused them pain? So that bill passed swiftly through the House of Commons unanimously on every vote. Had support from all parties, and it was passed late though in the parliamentary session, and so we were sort of under the clock to get it into the Senate. And unfortunately, despite it having a lot of support from senators, it just sat at the bottom of the order sheet and did not move past first reading. So unfortunately, the House rose and the Senate rose, and the bill has perished in the Senate.
Wow. And what does that mean for the bill? Like, is there a chance that it'll be, considered at a later time, or are you back to basically square one?
Well, there's an enormous amount of goodwill connected to that bill. There are a number of MPs from all parties who are very disappointed that it didn't pass. And I've had conversations with all parties to say that they're determined to see it come back in the fall and determined to see it pass and to give it support. So I'm holding them to that, and I believe that they will. We're facing an election in the fall, so hopeful that all of them will be back in the fall to see this bill through. We'll be able to pick up from where the Justice Committee left off with that report and advance some more reforms to impact Canadians.
Mm-hmm. Now, for people who are listening to this, and likely, as I was, surprised by I guess, what the situation a juror finds himself in after the trial wraps up. What should they do? Like, who should they contact, or where should somebody start to support you?
Well, we have an election coming up in the fall. So one of the best things you can do is be vocal with the candidate who knocks on your door. If you're concerned at the moment, you can write your local member of parliament and discuss directly with them. But I think, this should be an election issue. Jury duty is something that is called upon for all Canadians, and it hasn't kept pace with the modern world that we live in right now.
Mark's story, at least to me, really highlights the need for changes in how Canadian jurors are treated both during and especially so post-trial. I see the value in having a jury of one's peers weigh the merits of a specific case, but the way I see it, that's a big ask of those peers, and the least we can do is make sure they come out the other end in one piece. Clearly, Mark feels the same way. Oh, and as a sort of grim side note to all this, the hell Mark went through during and after the trial of Farshad Badakshan, in the end, it was mostly in vain. Just 1 month after Mark and the other jurors found him guilty of second-degree murder, the 31-year-old took his own life in a jail cell. If you're interested in learning a bit more about that case, I've added some links to the show notes. And with that, we'll conclude this episode of Nighttime. If you want to dig into this story and the dark side of jury duty, you should come join me and my best friend Randy on the Nightcap post-show discussion. You can subscribe at patreon.com/nighttimepodcast. But before we get to that, I want to end by giving thanks to some of those who assisted in this episode. To start, of course, a huge thanks goes to our guest, Mark Farrant, for opening my eyes to what it means to serve on a Canadian jury. Mark, jurors across the country, both now and in the future, are fortunate to have someone with your skill sets and passion working to make things better. You and those fighting alongside you have already accomplished so much simply by sharing these issues with the public. And I know you're still far from done, so my hat's off to you. Next, I want to give a shout out to Vox Somnia and Paragon Cause for providing the musical themes for this episode. You can check out both of these great artists by following the links in the episode notes. And now I'll end with the biggest thanks of all. I want to thank everyone who's listening, as without you, I'd have no excuse to spend so much of my free time on this show. For anyone out there who wants more nighttime, check out my Patreon campaign. For $1 a month, you can access the ad-free premium feed, which provides early releases of the episodes. And then, for only a couple dollars more, you can get access to the Nightcap After Show, in which I and a guest climb even further down the rabbit hole than what you hear here in the main episodes. You can join and support the show by visiting patreon.com/nighttimepodcast. Now, with that said, I'd like to thank the current patrons of the show and welcome the new members to the group: Patricia, Andrea, Karen, and Gooberson. I appreciate your generous support of Nighttime. For anyone else who'd like to support the show but can't help financially, you can give me a big hand by telling your friends about me and leaving a positive review on Apple Podcasts or whichever equivalent you use. If any of you listening want to stay up to date with my activities on and off the show, follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. My handle is @NighttimePod. If anyone listening has a story idea or wants to give feedback on the show, I'd love to hear from you at nighttimepodcast@gmail.com. Now until next time, take care of each other, hug your loved ones tight, and let me know if you see anything weird.
The Nighttime Podcast is written, hosted, and produced by Jordan Bonaparte. Copyright Jordan Bonaparte.